here I am in another spot. I took my robe off so I could sit out in the garden and talk to the kids. I'll have my robe back on for the end of the service. But the sermon today kind of felt like a conversational sermon, felt like not preaching. I mean, it's Pentecost. Shouldn't it be a hellfire, brimstone? Shouldn't I bring out my best hellfire and brimstone style? But it just felt like today that it was more like a one-on-one, a casual conversation type of sermon day. People tell me that once in a while somebody will say, I felt like you were talking to me in that sermon. And if people feel that, that's great. But I will never preach a sermon at somebody. If somebody gets out of something and hears it in a certain way, that's great. But I will never preach at somebody. But today I want to talk one-on-one, and maybe more like one and one y'all. But I want to talk about acknowledging the grief. We spend lots of our time talking about when the schools are going to open up, or when camps are going to happen, or when we can go out to the restaurant, or when we can do in-person worship at church, when we can go watch a Little League game, when we can go, you fill in the blank. You know it, you're thinking it. We spend time looking at the future, but we don't spend a time looking at the now, at how we're feeling, about the grief we have that our kids can't go to school, or that we can't go visit a neighbor, or we can't go visit somebody in the hospital, or we can't eat peanuts at a Little League game, or we can't do indoor in-person worship at church, or we can't just go down to a restaurant. We just can't do the things that we normally used to be able to do. And I want to spend some time acknowledging that grief. As a society, I don't think we do well with dealing with grief, especially with other people's grief. When I was divorced, I had people that would come up. I had a person who had been divorced who came up to me and said, Pastor, some days you are going to want to be with people, and some days you're not going to want to be with people. And that was kind of helpful advice because he had been there and that rang true. But there were a few people who said things like, you're young, you'll find another partner. And that didn't help acknowledge the current grief. That didn't help acknowledge how I was feeling at the time. And the same thing with a couple miscarriages that we had in my family. People kind of said, Pastor Jeff, you'll have another kid. You're young. You can have other kids. Without saying things like, man, that must be tough. I'm sorry. It must be tough to feel that grief. Let me sit with you. But as a society, we kind of want to gloss over that grief and kind of just go to like, it will be okay. It's going to be better. You'll be fine. When we aren't fine. And you probably know the stages of grief, shock and pain and anger and depression, upward turn, reconstruction and acceptance. And I don't want to talk about where we all are in those stages of grief, but I want to talk that we do feel grief, and that's okay. You may remember the confirmation trick of when you had to memorize a Bible passage. Everybody would pick the shortest one, Jesus wept. Jesus wept at the death of his friend Lazarus. When Lazarus' sisters told him about Jesus' death and said, come see him, Jesus wept. And it's kind of, I don't know as I read that passage whether he wept because they were weeping, he got caught up in their emotions, or he wept because Lazarus had died. I'm sure it's probably both. But reading at this time for the first time, it wasn't just about whether Jesus was sad that Lazarus' death, but I wonder if he got caught up in the emotions of Mary and Martha. Jesus felt what we feel. Jesus knows what grief is. It wasn't, it wasn't move on, get over it. He's dead. Let's go on. It was Jesus wept. He was experiencing the emotion of grief, the emotion of grief. And you see, that's what I like about the fact that God became fully human in Jesus. He understands what it means to be human. God understands what it means to feel grief. Now, I'm not going to apologize, but I'm going to tell you right now, this sermon has no dramatic answers. It's not going to be, here's how to end your grief. Move on. You'll have peanuts next year at your kid's game. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to acknowledge the grief and to remind you, because God was fully human in Jesus, that God knows what our grief is like. It's just to acknowledge that it is normal to grieve. This sermon has no dramatic answers. There's no way it's not to get you out of your grief, but just to acknowledge that it is normal to grieve. It is important to grieve. We need to grieve. And we have a God who knows how to grieve with us. Amen.